This week, I'll be reviewing the VILTROX 50mm F1.8 full-frame lens for the Sony E-mount. Bear in mind that I'm a narrative filmmaker, so I will be largely reviewing this lens through that lens. Also, definitely stick around because I'll be testing the lens in front of my ultra short throw projector that I'll be using like an LED volume for a few cinematic setups. It kills me a little bit inside to say cinematic, but you gotta do what you gotta do for the algorithm, right? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Scott Jeske, and if you find these videos helpful or entertaining, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. It helps me tremendously to keep these videos going on top of my day job and being a dad and husband and all those things. Now, full disclosure, I am not being paid by VILTROX to make this video, but they did send me the lens and they kindly asked for my honest review while providing me with an affiliate link. And if you click the link below, you can get a 10% discount at the VILTROX store. And though they were very kind to send the lens to me, they also advocated for honesty, and I can promise you that I will be as objective as possible in my review of this lens. So now that we got all that out of the way, let's talk about the VILTROX 50mm F1.8 full-frame lens for Sony E-mounts. This lens retails at $379 US. It has a maximum aperture of f1.8 and a minimum aperture of f16. The lens does also feature this really cool USB-C port on the bottom here for firmware updates, which I thought was unique and cool. It has autofocus, it comes with a hood, and the lens weighs 1.35 pounds, which I actually like. I have seen some discussion about this lens feeling a bit large for a 50mm, but to me it feels high quality in its build. It has a metal exterior that feels very solid and highly durable, but also the lens isn't too big. It has a 55mm thread for filters. The focus ring is very smooth, though if you are using it for video, you would need an adapter ring for the follow focus grooves if you wanted to add a follow focus. The external aperture ring is really nice because it allows for manual aperture changing on the exterior, but also auto allows you to internally change it in camera. Initially, I wondered why this was a function, but I think it would be very useful if you were, for instance, adapting this lens to a different brand of camera and you needed to change the aperture. This option is nice, and shifting f-stops is smooth and there's no clicks when doing so manually. This is also a feature of the 50mm GM lens, which is a $2,000 lens, so that really puts this VILTROX a cut above the $200 Sony 50mm in terms of build quality and design, at least from my general knowledge on this. Now let's talk about autofocus. Bear in mind that I am only reviewing this lens from a video perspective. I know autofocus functions very differently for photography, but I am addressing this purely from a video perspective, and as you can see here, the autofocus is very good overall. The motor does make a very slight sound that can be picked up by the camera's microphone, but this doesn't bother me for 90% of my use cases. And I think a top-mounted shotgun mic wouldn't pick it up if you were vlogging, for instance. And visually speaking, I found the autofocus overall to be very smooth, very accurate for video. It tracked well and it didn't seem to have much trouble. There is a little bit of electronic breathing here and there, but overall it has a smooth manual feel to it. It's not quite as responsive as my Tamron, but it didn't feel like something that would put me in a bind on a shoot. Now let's talk about the image quality. Overall, I would say this is my very favorite part of the lens. It's very sharp at all stops, and I didn't notice any major vignetting. And here is a chart at f1.8, f2.8, f4, f8, and f16. It definitely gets sharper at f16, but that's normal, and overall the lens doesn't seem to lose quality at any of those major f-stops. Flaring is relatively smooth with no major artifacts, and it has a pleasing look. There's not a ton of character in the flare one way or another, probably I think because it has an HD nano multi-layer coating that is applied to individual elements to reduce flare and ghosting. And this is likely most helpful for daytime exteriors, looking into the sun for instance, and it will help render accurate colors. But overall you can still see that the lens is very sharp and has a good deal of character in the out of focus parts of the frame. Which brings me to the subject of bokeh. This is an aspect of the lens that I think could be hit or miss for users, depending on what they like in a lens. I did a few comparisons with my Tamron 28-75, set it to 50mm, and I had both lenses at f2.8, and you can see that the Tamron has smoother, more round blur circles, whereas the edges on the VILTROX are a little more apparent. Having said that though, when you set the VILTROX to f2.8, the bokeh is closer to circle shaped. Wide open at f1.8 is where I think we will find some differing opinions. At f1.8, the bokeh has a slightly oval shape that curves outward toward the edges of the frame. It's far from circular and smooth. This might be bothersome to some users, but I found this to be one of the more appealing attributes of the lens. It has a lot of character and it gives it a unique look that is set apart from something more clean and clinical like my 28-75 Tamron, which is a lens that I love. For me, this is a more subjective aspect of how you are going to view the lens. Some might find this to be a flaw, while others might find this to be something that makes the lens look and feel unique. I personally like how, again, it adds some character to the edges of the frame a little bit without reducing the sharpness and clarity of the lens overall. For narrative filmmaking, this feels like a plus to me. Here I'm going to show you a few examples using the lens and comparing it to the Tamron at 50mm in front of my projection screen with a few different lighting scenarios. I included this because, as you know, I'm a narrative filmmaker and I wanted to show the possibilities of using a lens with this amount of character in different lighting situations and looks, just to give you a feel of how this affects your image. So, the moment of truth. What are my overall thoughts on the VILTROX 50mm f1.8 lens? Is it a lens that is worthy of being in your kit? And overall, I would say yes, it is. I can't speak to the photography side of the lens, nor have I used the Sony 50mm equivalent, which is cheaper and smaller, but I do think despite the pricing difference and despite some flaws, this lens is extremely sharp. It renders good colors, it has some nice features, and it has excellent build quality. I think especially for narrative filmmakers, this lens has some good character to it that helps make the image feel unique and a little less clinical than some of the more conventional lenses. Now, being completely objective here, my biggest issue with this lens is the minimum focus distance being at 55 centimeters, which is 10 centimeters further away from the Sony equivalent at 45 centimeters. To me, this isn't a deal breaker, but it does limit some of the uses for the lens. However, I don't think that 50mm is the best lens for most close-up scenarios anyway. To me, it's more appropriate for medium or medium close-up shots. So I don't think that's a deal breaker, but it is something to consider when looking at the lens, and it is something that I wish it had a little more wiggle room on. The VILTROX lens also is slightly more expensive than the standard Sony 50mm, but I think it has a much higher build quality with its aluminum body, and it is significantly cheaper than the Sony GM lens. For my use cases and for narrative film work, the autofocus didn't present any issues for me. Even when I was in the shadows as a subject, the lens tracked very well, so I can't speak to other users' photography experiences. Now, the price is more expensive than the Sony f1.8 equivalent, but I think with the build quality that is more similar to the GM f1.2 version, the price is justified. It's really not all that expensive for the value. Now, is this the kind of lens that feels like an investment for several decades? Maybe, maybe not. I do think it's a great lens though if you're building out your Sony kit, or maybe you are in the early phases of your career and you're starting to invest in some new primes. For me personally, this lens came out at a perfect time because I switched from Canon to Sony only in the past 5 years, so I've had to be rebuilding my lens collection, and lenses are expensive, so I primarily use a 28-75mm Tamron, which is fantastic in a myriad of use cases. But recently I've been wanting to invest in some primes, and this lens to me is a great place to start. And it's closer to the price range that I would prefer for most primes. And again, a 28-75 is a very well-rounded lens, but sometimes you do need something more specialized. You need a higher f-stop. So I think this lens really hits the sweet spot for that and fills that space for me. I mean, overall, honestly, I do think this is a really nice lens, and I'm looking forward to using it more on future projects. If you guys have any questions or thoughts on the lens, please sound off in the comments below. I love hearing your feedback. I love engaging with you. And as always, thank you guys for watching. And if you like what you saw, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, share the video. It helps me a bunch to keep these videos coming. So thank you guys again, and I'll see you next time. Bye.